Welcome to the Glenn Beck program. Well, today around 2 o'clock, Anthony Weiner announced his resignation. This is a man that arrogance and out of control doesn't begin to describe him. Sending naked pictures of himself, texting porn stars, even driving around with a car with a license plate that wasn't the right license plate for the car. The car wasn't even registered. This guy was totally out of control. He's an elected official who also last year tried to use the full power and force of the United States Congress, and did, to go after me and this program and my #1 radio client. He tried to shut my business down for political purposes. He tried to smear me and my client with the power of the Congress. He did so by using a bogus narrative that somehow or another I was committing ethics violations, while he was looking apparently into the porn ethics, etc., etc. This was a man who was in the midst of sending naked pictures of himself from the congressional gym to strangers while trying to smear me. It would be easy today for me to celebrate his exit. But the garbage in his life is now out, and the garbage that he has brought into our life is also now out. So now we are left with him just being a citizen, just like you and me, a man struggling with his problems, and problems he has. But he has a chance to make things right and to start all over. So tonight, personally, as a citizen, I am glad that he is gone. I thought he was doing an awful lot of damage to our country for a myriad of reasons. But as one human being to another, I wish Anthony Weiner serenity. And I truly hope that he finds the path to turn his life around. I said to my daughter today, I was sitting on the couch in my office, my daughter popped in and she said, "How you doing today, Dad?" And we watched this Anthony Weiner thing, and I said, "You know what?" She said, "What are you going to say today?" And I said, "I'm going to do the right thing, but I want you to always remember this, Hannah." She said, "What?" And I said, "Doing the right thing really sucks a lot of the time, but it's the right thing to do." Hello, America. You know, I've got a really weird thing for you today. This program has baselessly alleged over the last 27 months that progressives have embarked on a 100-year campaign to chip away at the American culture, to undo everything that our founders have done, and one of the battlefields in that war is the classroom. That way, suddenly, America would wake up one day, they would know nothing about the founding history of our country, and we would be a country that would be lost. What crazy accusations. In a completely unrelated story, the annual study of American history, the nation's report card, has just been released. Told you a little bit about this yesterday. Only 20% of fourth graders performed at or above a proficient level. They didn't even know what the Declaration of Independence was. Eighth graders, it was worse. Only 17% performed at that proficient level. And for 12th graders, 12%. We went over some of the questions yesterday, and it is stunning how little our kids know. You cannot be a country. You cannot survive if you don't even know your own history. Now, baselessly, I charge that this is intentional, partly. I mean, what better way to finally achieve the progressive dream of abandoning the Constitution, which they feel is a charter of negative liberties, than to make it old, antiquated document that nobody knows anything at all about? But I said it's partly a progressive agenda. Let's not just single out the progressives or the teachers or the kids or anything else. Hello, we are part of the problem as well. Because most of us aren't much better. We have taken our freedoms for granted for so long, we've lost our passion for it, because all we really do when we were kids is memorize dates. Who cares? Not the stories, and the stories are what is the important part. The adults have been caught on video now, put together by the Media Research Center. They're out front of the White House, and they were asked, can you tell us a little bit about our country? Really, really easy question, like, who's the Vice President of the United States? Watch us.
Who is the Vice President of the United States?
It's that crazy guy who doesn't know much.
The crazy guy who doesn't know much. Who is the Speaker of the House?
Speaker of the House, I know it's not Pelosi anymore.
I know the name if I heard it, but I don't recognize it at the moment.
I don't know. I don't know any of this stuff.
Okay.
Nope.
Oh, the crier. The guy who cries all the time.
The guy who cries all the time. Can you name one other member of the U.S. House of Representatives?
The most famous one at the moment, Anthony Weiner.
How sad is that? They could name Anthony Weiner, but they couldn't name Joe Biden or John Boehner. For a minute, I was like, no, I'm not the Speaker of the House. And then I went, oh, that's right, John Boehner cried too, that's right. In fairness, to the Vice President, I mean, Obama has to keep Joe Biden locked into in a closet or an undisclosed location for at least 78% of the year for national security purposes alone. You let that guy out for 5 or 10 minutes, and the next thing you know, he's having drinks with Ahmadinejad and he's giving away nuke secrets. So you've got to keep that name down. Is this a lack of education and a lack of interest in our nation's past? I'm speaking as a whole because I know you are engaged. You wouldn't have made Road to Serfdom a #1 bestseller if you weren't interested in history. Many Americans are. But the media can just bash Sarah Palin. The public can bash Sarah Palin for her remarks on Paul Revere, and nobody says anything because nobody knows the truth. A couple of weeks ago, they called Sarah Palin stupid and every other name in the book. It's not new to the Palins. They're used to it, I'm guessing, by this point. But historians were immediately asked about this. Yes, believe it or not, this is the story, and one of the only stories the press ruthlessly investigates. Sarah Palin. Well, they pointed out, the historians did, a 1798 letter written by Paul Revere, where he describes how after his capture by the British officers, he warned that there would be 500 Americans there in a short time, for, quote, I had alarmed the country all the way up. That's what Sarah Palin said he did. Several Boston historians said, you know what, Palin's correct. One Boston University historian, Brendan McConville, listen to this, said, basically, when Paul Revere was stopped by the British, he did say, look, there's a mobilization going on that you're going to be confronting. And the British are aware as they're marching down the countryside, they hear church bells ringing. She was right about that. And firing warning shots. That's accurate, end quote. But wait, there's more to this story. Despite the historic evidence on her side, he added that he wasn't convinced that Palin remarks reflected scholarship. Quote, I'd call her lucky in her comments. Really? What a lucky stab in the dark, huh? Others weren't quite as kind. One historian, even with the matching letter and Sarah Palin's comments, then went on to not only discredit her, but also said he wasn't sure that Paul Revere was telling the truth. So the historians put you in a position to where they're saying, for political reasons, no, you can't listen to even the guy who wrote the letter, the guy who the story is about, Paul Revere. You got to listen to us. We know better. They're so desperate to mock and trash for political purposes that they are willing to distort and ignore political facts for political gain, or historic facts for political gain. They also bashed her when she told a Tea Party crowd, party like it's 1773. The media, of course, thought she was referring to the Declaration of Independence, which of course was signed in 1776. And it has become an accepted Palin gaffe. But if people knew their history, they would have turned on the media a lot earlier. They would know that she was referring to the Boston Tea Party, talking to a Tea Party, telling them to party like 1773, which is the year the Boston Tea Party happened. The same thing happened when we, this program, talked about the 3/5 clause in the Constitution, and when Michelle Bachmann was assailed for saying that our forebears fought against slavery. We're no longer teaching the truth in America, and the truth is so clear. You want the 3/5 clause? Go back and read Frederick Douglass. Go back and read his own words. He makes such a clear case for it. He ends in one of my favorite phrases, something, I'm paraphrasing, something along the lines of, so stop with the 3/5 clause. What are our children learning? They don't know about history. They don't know about America. But they do know about Che. Well, they know about a kinder, gentler side of Che. They buy the T-shirts to show solidarity with a glorious communist revolutionary. What they're not taught about Che might make them rethink the T-shirt. But then again, I don't know how many of us are even thinking anymore. Che hated America and generally was a pretty evil dude. In fact, he wanted to destroy America. Quote, if the rockets had remained, we would have used them all and directed them against the very heart of the U.S., including New York, in our defense against aggression. But we haven't got them, so we shall fight with what we've got. Every battle action is a battle cry against imperialism and for the battle hymn for the people's unity against the great enemy of mankind, the United States of America. Does it sound familiar? It's Che, but it could be a lot of revolutionaries that are currently working in and around our government. Che was also a racist. Does anybody wearing a T-shirt or carrying a Che purse know that? On the African American, quote, the Negro is indolent and a dreamer, spending his meager wage on frivolity and drink. The European has a tradition of work and saving. He was a murderer. Quote, to send men to the firing squad, judicial proof is unnecessary. These procedures are archaic bourgeois detail. This is revolution. And a revolutionary must become a cold killing machine motivated by pure hate. End quote. How do you feel about your T-shirt when you hear this one? Love of being a murderer. Quote, I feel my nostrils dilate, savoring the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood. Che was personally responsible for overseeing at least 163 executions. More than 100 of these were just political prisoners deemed to be traitors. Our society has glorified him. And somehow or another, our founders and our Constitution have become irrelevant or somehow or another evil. If an animal like Che can over time have his history twisted to the point where he is an international icon and our Constitution can be made irrelevant and oppressive, we stand no chance of survival. But there is good news. America is waking up. Sanity isn't completely dead. We told you about a story out of Arizona, and the top education official said yesterday that the ethnic studies program, you remember, the one we told you about that called for the overthrow of the United States government and had these students chanting for it because they were all revved up by former hippie revolutionaries. The superintendent said that course violated a new state law that if they don't cut the class, they risk losing 10% of their funding, about $15 million. The media describes this new law as controversial. Well, I want to tell you how controversial this is. Brace yourself. Here it is. This new controversial law, as described by the press, bans K-12 programs that, quote, promote the overthrow of the U.S. government. How controversial. Promote resentment towards a race or a class of people. How controversial. Or are designed primarily for pupils of one ethnic group or advocate ethnic solidarity. How controversial. I always thought white power would be bad. What's the difference if you just change the color? It's not controversial. We are being led astray intentionally. About a week ago, I asked you, And I told you, what do we have? 11 shows remaining. We have 11 shows remaining, 10 after tonight on this network. We have tried to do history. I think there are many, I know, on our crew, including me, and many in our audience that have learned things on this program, in particular about African American history, that nobody has ever, none of us knew. None of us knew. We asked you a few days ago, in our last 11 shows, if we did a show on history, what would you want? The number one thing was another session with my good friend David Barton, who, by the way, is this the first time we've been on TV since you were on with Jon Stewart?
It may be.
I think it was.
I think
you did a good job. I warned you. I said,
sir.
You're not going into a friendly place, but you handled him quite nicely. It's kind of hard to...
It was a fun conversation.
Yeah, it's hard to debate the fact when you're sitting across from David Barton. Right. I should have actually called Jon Stewart and said, I warn you. He's a killer. All right, David Barton is the founder and president of Wallbuilders. Josh Charles is the co-author of the original argument, a translation of the Federalist Papers, and Chris Stewart is the author of 7 Tipping Points That Saved the World. Okay, I want to start, I'm going to start with the audience, because you're going to direct this program today. Where do you want to start? Yes, sir.
Hey, Glenn, I sit down in the offices of some great members of Congress and the U.S. Senate, Bachmann, Pence, DeMint, Colonel West, and I ask them, how do we get back to the basics, back to the Constitution? And they say, we got to go back and we got to learn it. And I say, how do we learn the Constitution when some of the own Republicans that we put into office are against the Constitution? So I ask you, who's more dangerous? Is it George Soros and his minions, or is it some of these camouflage Republicans that we put in office and they screw us in our back?
I think the most dangerous of us, and let's talk about this one historically, I think the most dangerous of us is us. Because it's our responsibility, is it not?
Congress is a reflection of us. It reflects our lack of knowledge of this. Now, I will say one caveat. ISI, Intercollegiate Studies Institute, did the same kind of thing that NAEP just did with that history study. They took the questions that you have to know to become a citizen if you're an immigrant. If you know nothing about America and start from ground zero, here's what you have to know to be a citizen. They gave that to citizens, and 71% of citizens who live here didn't know enough to become a citizen in the United States. Here's the deal, though. They gave it to elected officials as well. Elected officials scored lower on the test than citizens did.
I believe that.
You know, as an officer of our government, an officer of representing the people, whether they're military officers or congressional leaders or Congress people, they swear an oath to the Constitution, and yet we don't require that they understand the Constitution.
Yeah.
There's a couple congressmen or senators who make a point of carrying a pocket Constitution around with them. And generally, they're ridiculed for that. Oh, isn't that quaint that they, that they're referring to the Constitution?
I used to be that guy. I used to be that guy who used to make fun of people who said, "Oh, gee, we're a republic, not a democracy." I'm like, give it a rest. Yeah. It does make a difference. I used to be the guy who ridiculed people who walked around with a pocket Constitution, because you immediately think pocket protector. You're like, oh. Well, hello, Mr. Geek.
Yeah.
How are you today? But you know what? That's all we have. We were talking on the air. Josh was on the air with me on radio today, and we were talking about, we call it now the good and plenty clause that John Conyers said. I don't remember what he actually...
General welfare clause. Right.
Yeah, the general welfare clause. Yeah. And we were at the time saying, I don't even know where that is. Yeah. I don't even know where that doesn't exist. He didn't even know the Constitution. Yeah. When we were talking about the 2,000-page bills, the Federalist Papers, what do they say about basically 2,000-page bills?
Basically, if the law is too complicated for people to understand it, that's a dangerous tipping point for any country, where the people that can't understand it, it's unintelligible even to the people who are writing it, and that's what's happened. We've become an administrative state where the government is so pushing itself in areas where it can't go, where these congressmen, congresswomen can't possibly be experts in the things they're legislating on, so they literally consign that responsibility to experts.
And which Federalist paper is it? Do you remember which one it is?
I honestly forget it.
62.
62.
Yeah. That says if you can't understand it, if you can't understand the bill, then people can't navigate in their own lives, and you can't do business. Yesterday, we heard the president say to the NBC said to the president, "How can you fix this economy if you can't get people to businesses to open up the purse strings?" And his response was, "Well, we have a lot of complex things going on, like, for instance, ATM machines." ATM machines? That's it? Like it's Rosie the Robot out dispensing cash. That's not it. It is in the Federalist paper, number 62. Read it. He says, was at Madison?
That was Madison.
Madison.
Yes.
He says in that, if the law becomes so complex that nobody understands it, business won't be able to do business because they'll be trying to figure out the laws and they won't be able to move forward. It's our fault. We have to study it and hold their feet to the fire. Back in just a second. I'm sorry, I just saw my lovely daughter off to the side who's in town for Father's Day. Hello, Mary. We're back with David Barton, Josh Charles, and Chris Stewart. And I have to tell you, and I've said this, I know, all week, Chris Stewart is a new friend of mine. I read one of your other books on my vacation, and I called him up. My wife about killed me. I called him up on vacation, and I said, "You, sir, are a genius," and wanted to talk to you about it. This is his new book. It is called The Seven Tipping Points That Saved the World. And would you agree that we are at a tipping point now?
Oh yeah, I absolutely would. And if you called me a genius, I have to mention you're the only person in the world who's ever done that.
Yes.
So, hope I can get a tape of this. But yeah, I think we are at a tipping point. When you look at the the coalition of events that are converging now, and I think that some of the things in our culture that have divided us.
Right.
And I don't think that we can sustain this like we have. Now, I don't think we need to be ignorant. I think there's been times in our past when we went through very, very difficult times, more so than we are now.
Yeah.
But this is a time when we need to come together.
Right.
And
but it's what we had at that time, we don't necessarily have now, or we're at the beginning of it, and that is an understanding that the Constitution was solid, that divine providence, that God was involved, right?
Yeah. And that's what the question is now. You have a worldview conflict we've never had before. We had a big fight over slavery and abolition, etc. But there was still respect for Constitution, still acknowledgement of God and His hand. Not now. There's a whole different thing. We're now at the point where we're looking at elections as, do I choose saving the economy or saving the Constitution? Let's save the economy. And if we go in that direction, we'll lose everything. We're toast, exactly.
James Wilson was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, and when he took the Constitution back to his constituents to get it ratified, he said at the very end of his speech, after admitting the Constitution was not perfect, these men knew it wasn't perfect, he said, "I am bold to assert that it is the best form of government ever offered to the world." And so right now, in terms of solving these problems, there is that lack of boldness.
There's another aspect to it, too, and that is when you look at George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, you look at James Madison, you look at Franklin, all these guys who are part of it, they said this thing is a miracle.
Yes.
Yeah. George Washington said there is no act of providence any greater than what we just had. He told Lafayette this, what we just had in doing this Constitution, you'll find no act of providence greater than what we just had. Yeah. And if we dismiss that, Daniel Webster once said about the Constitution, miracles do not cluster. What has happened one time in 6,000 years may never happen again. Hold on to the Constitution. And because we're holding on to a divine miracle, if we lose that, there's no guarantee another miracle will happen like this.
And
he's bumming me out. I don't know.
And I actually think an extension of that point, it's easy for most of us to look back on our founding fathers or that foundational time and say, yeah, those were miraculous events. The preservation of George Washington's life, the miracle of fog at the East River just a few miles from here, and then the creating of the Constitution. We can list many things that we look back and say, I'm comfortable calling that a miraculous event. But I think there's a couple questions from that. One is, why did those things take place? Why was it so important that this nation be preserved, created and preserved? And then the second question, I think, is a fair question, is why do we not think that that can happen now? If you talked about this being a tipping point, why can't we expect for a miracle to happen now that would preserve us?
I do. Let me ask you, how many people believe, and think of this carefully, believe in the protection of divine providence for our nation?
Yeah.
Truly believe that. Yeah. Okay. how many people believe in that you could see in your lifetime true Moses-style miracles?
Yes.
I have news for you. I do.
Yeah.
I do. I have seen the shadows of them, and I believe they're going to happen. I really do.
Yeah. And I've got a great example of that, I think. You know, in 1980s, I was a young lieutenant pilot in the Air Force, you know, preparing like all the military to fight the Russian horde as they flowed through the Fulda Gap in Germany. And I remember flying with a friend of mine. We're kind of talking as we're in cruise, and him asked me the question, essentially says, do you think we'll ever see the fall of the Berlin Wall? And I remember thinking and very clearly answering him, saying, yeah, I think we will, but not in my lifetime. And it was not 18 months later that we sat there with our mouths open and watched that whole thing go away. And if anyone says to you, oh, yeah, we saw that coming, I just don't believe it. It's like guys who say, I was at Woodstock. Everyone claims it, but it's not the case. No one saw that coming.
I don't claim that, nor would I ever.
I'm obviously too young. But military intelligence or intelligence organization, no one predicted that that would happen the way it did in such a short time. And how can you look at that and say, what a miraculous event? And how many people have access to freedom now?
Let me reverse that. How many people do you know that now say, this could never fall apart? You know, could America fall apart? Oh, no, not in my lifetime. Yeah. That's a great point.
If you don't understand your foundations, it's real easy to fall apart because you don't know what you're defending or protecting.
David, can I put you on the spot? And I only have 1 minute, so I'm going to break early. And then when we come back, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to tell the story, because this is one of my favorite stories about the Constitutional Convention. And when I think it's the delegates of New York, and they're thinking about cheating. And they're like, hey, come on, can you give us some candy here? Because we got to take it back to New York. And I mean, have you seen the people on Broadway? They get pissy. And so he said, how can we live with ourselves if we don't do the right thing now? And it's one of my favorite phrases of Washington. You know what I'm talking about? One of my favorite phrases of Washington. And I contend that we are the people that he spoke about in that. And we'll go there next. Tonight, we have 11 programs left on the Fox News channel, and we wanted to bring a history one more time, at least one more time in the next 11 days. And we want to talk to David Barton, Josh Charles, and Chris Stewart. Before we went into the break, I asked David to help out on a story. It's one of my favorite news stories of George Washington, new for me, where they were at the Constitutional Convention. And they are arguing back and forth. Josh, you probably know this too. Arguing back and forth, and I think it was New York that said, "You got to help us out. I mean, we got to have something here because we weren't even sent to do this job." And Washington spoke up and he said, "We can't compromise." And I'm paraphrasing. He was much more eloquent than I could ever be, but he said, "How can we live with ourselves at the end if we would now compromise here with this opportunity? We have to do the right thing." He said, "The event is in the hand of God. Let us raise
a standard.
Let us raise a standard.
Yeah, to which the wise and just can repair."
Do you believe that he expected us, that we are now to be the wise and just? That we're not.
Yeah.
But we need to be.
He also gave a speech after that where he said that Providence has plainly put it in the hands of the people. And if it gets off track, it'll be the people, but I can't believe that will ever happen. I mean, his optimism was so high, and that's what he expressed. John Adams, shortly after that, gave a speech where he says, every citizen has to become for himself a statesman. He has to judge and read every legislative act, because that's the only way you can hold them accountable, is you have to know what they're doing, because they'll tell you stuff. So they went through and talked, and it's really kind of a different time frame in that they had representative government, but they did it very differently than what we do today. If you look at their elections they had back then, any candidate who put himself forward for office was automatically disqualified for office. You went into the polling booth with a blank piece of paper, and on it you said, I want Glenn Beck for mayor, and I want Josh to be my senator, and then they would count up the names. They'd go, they chose you for mayor. You going to be mayor? and you had a choice at that point. You never ran for office. People recognized their leaders. They said if you...
That's fantastic.
The statement that Sam Adams said was if you put yourself forward for office, you will become a dangerous party man.
Can I tell you something?
And that was his statement.
In my church, it's all done with callings like that. You don't become a bishop. You're called.
That's right.
And I was told, when I first joined my church, they said, if you ever want a calling, or you ever want to be a bishop, you'll never
make it. That's right.
And I said immediately, I am printing up buttons back for bishop.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's campaign on that. Let me go to Scott, because I think you kind of have a question that kind of fits here.
Well, I know one of the recurring themes has been kind of the contest between good and evil, and one of the things that always concerned me during the period of slavery is why more Southern Christians weren't morally stand up and understand the moral imperative and why slavery was so wrong. And did it boil down to economics? And also, why were we the only country in the world that actually fought a war over emancipation? All the other countries in Europe didn't do that.
Fun stuff.
And why did men of goodwill turn a blind eye to it for so long, or seemingly goodwill, which kind of seems to be a theme today, that we have people of goodwill that turn a blind eye to the morally right thing to do.
Yeah,
so that's kind of the whole discussion on today.
Before you start, let me just say this. Why are so many people turning a blind eye to sex slavery that is still going on all around the world, that is going stoning of homosexuals in Iran, and we don't really seem to care, to abortion, whatever. You can name them, and it seems as though people are asleep. People are no different, are they, now than they were then, on turning a blind eye? You can come up with a million different reasons for it.
I think we have a tendency to be less involved now because we watch things on TV and we elect people to represent us, and every member of Congress has 670,000 constituents. I'm just one. They won't listen to me. I don't have... And so we have talked ourselves by the tens of millions into thinking that we're impotent and have no ability to do anything. That, I think, is one difference from previous generations, is that we have a mentality that says, I can't make a difference. And yet the polling numbers still remain consistently high. This week, 61% of the nation said that having an abortion is morally wrong. That's a pretty strong number. 62% today came out and said, we think marriage should be a man and a woman only, no exceptions. That's strong. But we don't see that kind of political impetus going, although the numbers are high. But going back to the slavery thing, when John Quincy Adams finished his term as President of the United States, 1825, 1829, he went in, the only president ever become a member of Congress, and he went in with a nickname, the Hellhound of Abolition. He was not going to let go of that issue until he ended slavery. That was his nickname throughout. He spent 17 years as a one-issue congressman, and when he got there, he looked around at all the representatives, and the overwhelming majority were from the northern states that are anti-slavery. They've already ended slavery. He said the difficulty we have in Congress is they keep looking at slavery as an economic issue, not a moral issue. He said, if we can't make it a moral issue, if we keep it an economic issue, we'll never end it. Well, it finally became a moral issue because of things like the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, all this other stuff going on. You had a lot of... Go ahead.
Isn't it interesting that what's happening now in America, everything capitalism, it's becoming a moral issue. That capitalism hurts people. The border issue is, everything is social justice.
That's right.
Everything is so. Is that where that came from?
Well, that came actually after the Civil War. It didn't come from back there at that point in time, because they still had the clarity of not making things that were not moral into moral issues. Now we try to shroud everything with a moral respectability, and that tells us we're supposed to automatically back off and allow it, but it's not. But you do have the issue that when the people finally recognize as a moral issue the election of 1861, the people overwhelmingly said, we want a platform. We've got a Republican platform for president, for House and Senate. We want them in. They promised to abolish slavery. 11 planks, 9 of them abolished slavery. They put them in. It was then that half the Congress resigned and said, these guys, if they're going to abolish slavery, we're leaving. We're not. We always say the South seceded from the North. It was not. It was a group of political leaders who said, we're not going to be a part of ending slavery. And that was the inability of Congress to handle what the people had said through elections. They refused to do what the people said.
Back in just a second. Tonight we're talking a little bit about history with David Barton, Josh Charles, and Chris Stewart. Chris, we were talking in the break about the power of the individual in your book about tipping points. I'm struck by the fact that there are these moments that aren't necessarily leaders that it's taken by.
It can be an individual. You know, in this case, he emerged into a great leader, but it's hard for us, I think, to understand what a crisis and what a pivotal moment the Civil War was for our nation, and by extension, the rest of the world. Because what would the next century have been like had we not had a united United States? It was imperative that this nation stay together. And of all the people who hated Abraham Lincoln in the South, there were about as many who hated him in the North. He didn't have very many friends. And if you read the press at the time, that becomes very, very clear. He must have felt, I am alone, so many times. And yet, really the story of hope that comes out of that, here was a man who stood up to do what he felt was right against opposition from almost every corner. And yet, what a difference it made. And it was one of those tipping points that, you know, he changed not just the future of this country, but the future of the world because of that courage.
What would the founders tell us, or the Federalist Papers tell us, about our role? How do we prepare people to be Abraham Lincoln, or that person, the guy in the front of the tank at Tiananmen Square?
Sure. Well, the authors of the Federalist Papers make very clear that a moral and virtuous people ultimately solve the problem, and they keep the system going. Benjamin Franklin himself thought the system would fail after 50 or so years in his call for unanimity. He says, at the end of this, the people will be prepared for nothing less than despotic government. But it's kept going because of morally virtuous people, and I believe that in this day and age, people of faith will make the difference. In Isaiah, they're called repairers of the breach when the exiles are coming back from Babylon. Chronicles, the Lord is looking throughout the land to look for those whose hearts are fully committed to them and to strengthen them. They're going to make the difference. When you go to Wilmington and you show the power of prayer, I mean, the fact, I still talk with Robin Morris, and she's had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people from all over the country, even other countries, who have come, and they just want to set up prayer houses. People of faith will make the difference. All these problems will begin to be solved there.
So, how much time here, Aaron? Can I take it on the other side? Can I take that minute on the other side? Okay, I want to take a break because I want to go to Lori Martini. Basically, on that point, I think in a way, what could be the most recent tipping point. We'll do that next. Lori, how are you?
I'm excellent.
Where are you from?
Longport, New Jersey.
I'm sorry for that. All right, I'm kidding. All right, go ahead.
I wanted to know what you feel is the most recent tipping point, and in particular, if this country's support or lack of support for Israel is going to become the cause of a tipping point.
Who wants to take it?
Well, I tell you, historically, that has always been a tipping point for nations, the way they treat it. And I've got to go back to what the Founding Fathers did at the Constitutional Convention. Because when you look at what George Mason said and what Luther Martin said, they got into the aspect of national accountability. They said every one of us will account to God, but nations also account to God. And it was George Mason who pointed out that nations don't account to God in the next world, they count in this world. So if you believe that there's a God, if you believe that we are accountable to God, and you take something as simple as Genesis 12:3, where he makes a perpetual covenant, and he tells Abraham and his descendants, however they treat you, that's how I'm going to treat them. They bless you, I'll bless you.
That stinks on ice.
But that's what you see historically. Whether it be through the Middle Ages, through World War I, through World War II, through modern history, the position that a nation takes toward Israel determines their economic fate and their political fate more than anything else.
Name the countries, Josh. Quick, go!
Syria, Rome, Babylon, Germany. All the above.
You know,
Chris.
I might make a more practical rather than a historical observation. That is this, and I probably shouldn't say this. In my time in the military, I had a chance to work and train and exercise with countries from all throughout that region. And one observation I took away from that I'm certain of, and that is Israel is our closest and perhaps only true friend in that part of the world.
Oh yeah.
And if they are our ally, and they are, we need to recognize that. And
I'm convinced it is the end of the West if we don't support them and they fall. It is the end of the West and our lifestyle. Agree?
Agree.
Agree?
Yeah.
Agree? Does that answer?
Yes, thank you.
Stinks on ice too, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah, it does. All right. Let me see if I can get one more quick question. Yes, Peter.
Len, when do you think this apathy started? Is there a historical time point that you can point to in the country where people started to move away from believing in their politicians and paying attention?
Woodrow Wilson.
And how many generations of apathy do we have to undo?
Well, Woodrow Wilson is in a period really of great economic prosperity. And in the scriptures, God told his people, you're going to get that prosperity, and when you do, you're going to forget me. When you forget me, it's going to sink.
It really was. This is a time bomb that was planted, you know, starting with Teddy Roosevelt, the progressive era, time bomb planted. And they started the ball rolling. They thought it would go off a lot sooner, I think, than it has. But this is it. This is when the time period is. Now it requires us to do our own homework, do our own research, and return to the basics and the principles. Back in just a second. Thanks to our guests tonight, Chris Stewart, 7 Tipping Points, Joshua Charles, and from wallbuilders.com, David Barton. Thank you. We'll see you tomorrow with a quiz show. The things you learned on this show, or did you? Tomorrow night from New York. Good night, America.